This tonight is a plan for security, for prosperity, for growth. It's an economic strategy to help with cost of living pressures now and to maximise and extend the opportunities of the future to more of our people in more parts of our country in the defining, decisive decade ahead. And so, Mr. Speaker, for all of these reasons, I commend this bill and this budget to the House.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers unveiled a federal budget that he says strikes a considered and methodical balance between tackling inflation and supporting struggling Australians. In doing so, federal Labor have kicked off what some might dub budget season across the nation. And while the federal budget forecasted a modest surplus for the first time in 15 years, the state and territory budgets are likely to be less generous. Across Australia, the decisions that governments make in their budgets clearly signpost each administration's appetite for different projects. Today on Michelson Alexander Explains, I'm joined by Acting Associate Matilda and founder of Director of Michelson Alexander, Steve Michelson, to explore the key takeaways from the federal budget and how organisations should approach budget submissions for the upcoming financial year. Thank you for your time today, Tilly and Steve.
Thank you, Gordo.
Thanks, Gordo.
First to you, Tilly. The Treasurer said that the budget has found a balance between spending restraint to keep pressure off inflation whilst doing what they can to help people struggling to make ends meet. So what are the headline items from the 2023-24 budget?
So central to this budget was Labor's desire to strike that, as you said in your intro, that delicate balance between delivering cost of living measures but also trying to manage rising inflation. So we saw a surplus in this budget, which we have not seen since 2007, 2008, which is a pretty big achievement for Chalmers to come out with and it hasn't even been in Parliament for a year. So it's a pretty big achievement for Labor. We should say that Albanese accredited about 20% of this surplus to increase commodity prices. So on a bit of an unfortunate note, the war in Ukraine and rising energy prices around the world have actually worked in Australia's favour in a way, and all the exporting that we've been doing, particularly from Western Australia, and the fact that Western Australia's produce is extensive state for mining and producing iron ore, and the amount of exports they've been doing, they're producing record-breaking export trade routes. So we're sort of thinking that at the moment, Western Australia is part of the reason why we're seeing this surplus, but obviously the spending has been, the priority of where the spending is going has been quite different to, say, Frydenberg's budget 2 years ago. So it's going to be interesting to see, though, whether, as economists start to unpack the budget over the next couple of months, whether that balance has actually been struck, though, between cost of living measures and whether you prevent any form of inflation. So this budget is, as part of the cost of living I was just talking about, is promising $4.6 billion to a cost of living package. And this is going to have a focus on energy bills, on bringing down out-of-pocket health costs, which is huge, raising the rate of 3 support payments and some others, and creating more affordable housing and trying to reduce rental payments, things like that. So for energy bill relief, we're going to see more than 5 million households have up to $500 deducted from their power bills in the next financial year, which is a welcome relief for a lot of people, but some will also say that it's not really going far enough. We're going to see lower out-of-pocket health costs. So building on the momentum from Chalmers' budget in October last year, had a lot of focus on health and mental health, and it seems like he wants to keep this momentum going. He's going to deliver the biggest increase to Medicare in its 40-year history, which is really exciting. So he's going to invest $3.5 billion in bulk billing incentives, which is supposedly supposed to immediately benefit 11 million Australians. So it's huge. It's almost half the population. They're also going to do, for common medicines, they're going to make them a lot cheaper. So they're going to halve the amount of patient visits to the GP. So if you're going to pay for a script, you can get 2 months worth, not 1 month when you go to your GP now. So it's going to limit how many people are going to the GP, going to a pharmacist, and it should save an estimated $1.6 billion, and it will free up millions of GP appointments. This is one of the biggest crises that we're facing at the moment, is the lack of GP appointments. For mental health, I thought this is worth pointing out, there's going to be a 500 additional post-grad psychology places and 500 one-year internship placements for provisional psychs. But I think one of the first things that popped into my head was you really could do more. We're in a very significant mental health crisis. The waiting times to see a psychologist at the moment is through the roof. It's at least 6 months for some places. So I think there would be a lot of question marks around this and going into the next couple of months as to whether the government does more. One of the biggest things that we should touch on is support payments. So there's so many people around Australia, regardless of your age bracket, is relying on support payments. So there's going to be $40 extra per fortnight for JobSeeker, Youth Allowance and Austudy recipients and some other income support payments. in what has been a big part of Albo's sort of election campaign was talking about single parenting. He talks very often about, his upbringing and things like that. Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, has expanded the payment for single parents. So the payments are now available to single parents until their youngest child turns 14, which used to be 8 years old. So this is a very significant increase. But as we were talking about before this morning, Albanese has said that the job is not done for these support payments, which, potentially, I don't know, is hinting at some further increases. And then finally, I'm going to leave it, I haven't touched on everything I should say, but I'm going to leave it with green energy. We saw a $4 billion investment to a green energy package, and I'll get into the particulars a little bit later.
So as much as the budget, and its thousands and thousands of pages are about the dollars and cents, you told us last year when we addressed the budget that it's also about signposting and storytelling. So two kind of contrasting themes from the storytelling here from the budget are, look at Labor, we're being so fiscally responsive and responsible, but also we're trying to help Australians in need. How have you seen the theme of this budget? Does it tell a concise story?
I think that really what you saw last night was a truly Labor budget. As Tilly spoke about, the reality is that the revised budget forecasts from last year that saw Jim announce the $4.2 billion surplus last night were because of those significant increases in commodity prices. And it is also worth touching that kind of bittersweet point that Tilly touched on, which was around the cause of that in large part being the Ukraine war and obviously some of the international implications. Labor, of course, has a choice though. Labor could have spent that windfall on any number of things. And as Tilly's spoken about, there's some really important things in there around clean energy. There's also other measures in there for small business, for example, and different parts of the economy. But the centrepiece of last night was the $14.6 billion investment in support payments and ultimately in the welfare system, including those increases to the single parenting payment, but also rent assist, and other fixed income payments. And that to me is really what made last night a very Labor budget, because Labor made a call to invest in those areas. And I don't think politically those moments come along very often. And so all kind of strength to their arm. I think the other signal for me was last night, and perhaps just knowing some of the people, but when I was watching Jim deliver his budget speech, I could actually see some people who were sitting behind him, both, ministers, assistant ministers, but also members of the backbench, some of whom were starting to tear up a bit. And you could really see the heart and soul that some of them had put into this. It was a very kind of raw, emotional, visceral moment. And I don't think we often see that in politics. We certainly don't see enough of it. And she wouldn't mind me saying it, but, Annika Wells, who's the Minister for Aged Care, when the announcement was made around the increase in wages, for our aged care workers across Australia, you could actually really see that she was getting quite emotional about it. And so to me, that tells me that this is a budget that speaks very much to Labor values.
And so one of the headline talking points both last night and leading into the budget was around the NDIS. And so despite a commitment made by Bill Shorten to rein in the NDIS, this budget still allowed for 8% growth year on year. So what does the future hold for stakeholders that also rely on the NDIS but also work within the NDIS?
Appropriately, the Labor government's done a really good job of selling the budget last night. They did that in the weeks leading up to, they'll do it in the weeks following. But part of the effectiveness of that sell is that so far there's not really much commentary around cuts. There's been a bit of a grumble, as you'd expect, from the Greens and the minor parties around the alleged inadequacy of increases to, say, JobSeekers, but there's not really been anything around cuts. Now, the reason why that's relevant is because there will almost certainly be something in the budget papers about cuts that were made or that are going to be made to the NDIS, and I think we'll hear more about that on Thursday night. What does it mean? I think it's too early to tell. I think on the one hand, if the opposition were effective in their campaign and in their politics, it could be very disruptive for the government, because really this is a Labor legacy. It's something that Labor created, and last night Jim was talking about, the NDIS being something that Labor will sustain, The flip side is, though, that I do think that Labor needs to rein in the spending. We need to strike that balance between having a system that's compassionate and that cares and serves and supports. But also we are talking about a scheme which is at risk of becoming so big that the social licence that's attached to it is at risk.
So seen in response to massive rates of people smoking tobacco and a lot of vaping on the streets, particularly with younger people, we've seen these new anti-vaping campaigns that will roll out over the next 4 years. And we've also seen a government come out and say that they're going to create much harsher restrictions on how you can access vapes. It's going to be higher taxes on tobacco, things like that. So we've now seen a $63.4 million increase in the advertising campaign and a $29.5 million for support services to help people quit smoking and vaping in a move to just completely stamp out the habit. Is there an opportunity here for other public health campaigns to align themselves with this measure? Because there's several that want to work in this space and care about this space.
Yeah, it's a great question, Tilly. And to begin to respond it with an anecdote, I mean, my daughter is 8, turning 9 next month. Some would say 19, but let's leave that to one side. And, you know, she came home the other month and asked me about what a vape was from school, and she's in grade 3. And I said to her, when did you hear about that? And she said, well, I heard about it at school, you know. And to think that our primary school children are talking about vapes, even in the context of curiosity, I think should cause all of us concern. So against that backdrop, I have nothing but praise for Mark Butler, who really has led this charge as Federal Health Minister, and I think struck the balance in what is a really complex, not just regulatory environment, but also health setting insofar as the role of vapes. And we all know there's a difference between non-nicotine vapes and nicotine vapes, but the leadership that we've seen now, I think, represents the same sort of leadership that we've seen in other public health campaigns around, you know, cigarettes and tobacco consumption, but also before that, campaigns like, you know, Australians wearing seatbelts. So I think it's historic reform and I think it should be welcomed. I also think, though, that we should go further, and I think we can go further. I think a good example of that is an issue like addiction. So whether that's drug, alcohol, gambling addiction, I mean, this is something that Michelson Alexander has really proudly supported along with so many others in recent times. But I'd really love to see the federal Labor government and supported, I think, by the federal opposition and other political stakeholders, develop a really robust alcohol and other drugs policy. To me, this is the next frontier. Interestingly, last night, we didn't hear the word COVID once. I think we heard the word pandemic once or twice in Jim's speech, granted, but there wasn't a great focus on the pandemic. And we all know that that contrasted to last year's budget, where that was absolutely a focus. But the reason why that's relevant is when it comes to alcohol and other drugs is I think we've got to be careful as a nation not to forget all of the negative impacts of the pandemic. They haven't gone away. And issues around addiction, issues around alcohol, drug consumptions, issues around gambling, they are all still live issues. They are all deserving not only of greater investment, they are deserving of more political attention. And so I do think what the federal government's done around vaping is really impressive. It should be welcomed. It's long overdue. But to me, the question is what's next? And I think there's a whole opportunity insofar as achieving good policy and funding outcomes that can be met with good political outcomes as well when it comes to addiction.
So you think that organisations who work in those spaces, whether it's drug and alcohol use or if it's vaping or tobacco, whatever kind of area they work in, they should really keep pushing the government and remind them COVID is still only, I mean, I know that the World Health Organization has declared it's no longer, you know, a global emergency, but it is still very much a prominent thing. It's what's fueling our mental health crisis and things like that. Do you think organisations need to keep pushing and saying, this is not going to go away, we need to have more funding, more policy initiatives?
Yeah, I think they absolutely do, and I think they are. And I think, though, at some point or another, there comes a tipping point, I think, where these issues will, and not to say that they aren't given political focus, of course they are from time to time, but so often when we hear about alcohol and drug issues in the context of politics, it's always framed around something negative. You know, it's always around, you know, a high profile sports person who's had some sort of fallout with, or, you know, bad interaction with drugs or alcohol. And I'm not saying that's inappropriate, but what I'm interested in is, you know, the tipping point whereby politicians actually see this as an issue which deserves proactive political attention, that this is something where we see leadership that, you know, has politicians going out and making this a national political priority and having a conversation around addiction, having a conversation around the stigma that is connected to addiction. And the one thing we know about addiction is that it doesn't discriminate. Addiction can impact people from all walks of life, and it does. It impacts on our families, our work colleagues, our neighbours, our sporting club members. So yes, to answer your question, I think the alcohol and other drug sector needs to continue to agitate and be organised, and I think they're doing a pretty good job at that. But I also think the time has come for our political leaders to actually now, working from a really strong base like the vaping issue, to pick this up as a issue that is now deserving of national political attention.
One of the other issues that often is left into a reactive response is around renewable energy and green energy. And there seems to be a split currently in policies that affect industry. And so we had the $2 billion hydrogen Head Start program announced last night. And those policies that affect households. And so apparently 110,000 households approximately will receive low-cost loans for things like double glazing, solar panels and other energy improvements. Tilly, do you see any possibilities for a synergy between these two streams in the future?
Well, we should say first that the Hydrogen Head Start program is quite exciting. It's probably the biggest announcement or investment we've seen from federal government for hydrogen. It seems like we're finally catching up to the rest of the world who've been, in the hydrogen hype for quite some time now, and we've been catching up. So we should say as well that the Head Start program is going to be targeted at bridging that gap between the market price of hydrogen and the production cost of green hydrogen. It's mainly, and something Chalmers made quite clear in his speech and spoke quite passionately about, it's going to be aimed at those hard to abate sectors. So you're looking at heavy industry, producing green steel and exports, which is fantastic, and it could bring a lot of revenue to Australia. We're already looking at signing deals with South Korea and Japan for export trade connections. And there's, the Port Melbourne deal recently around using forms of green hydrogen to fuel shipping and aviation and things like that. So it's great. The thing that I think is going to be interesting, though, is that there's powering the home and then there's powering the heavy industry. And at the moment, we're seeing a shortfall in the amount of support for hydrogen in the home, green hydrogen, that is. And while it's fantastic that it's going into those hard to abate sectors and it's going to be something we're going to need, especially over the next decade, to really accelerate towards reducing emissions, there is a massive opportunity here that could be missed in Australia if we don't start thinking about how can hydrogen fuel the homes, how can it heat our homes, and it's a very safe form of fuel as well. And you've got countries like America producing these massive sort of policy initiatives and incentives that's already lowered the cost of hydrogen to I think it was US $3 per kilogram or something, which is a massive reduction. And if Australia doesn't kind of catch up, the rest of the world is going to start going to America for hydrogen. That's just the reality of it. So I think there is room to for both powering the home and the hard to abate sectors to kind of work together. But at the moment, we're seeing a massive discrepancy in where the support's going. And
in terms of choice, Steve, how important is it, I suppose, for policies to be effective by allowing choice for the end user and the homeowner? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's incredibly important, and I think there's no doubt that Australians are making a seismic shift towards renewable energy. Clearly, that's a really great thing, but I think we also have to accept that not every Australian can adapt to new technologies at the same rate. And I think the general shift that we've seen towards electrification is absolutely positive. But what we also know is that electrification and other forms of technology, whether they be solar or heat pumps or others, there is no one technology that is going to provide all of the answers in all of the scenarios to which we need to see change in order to meet our targets, and so my view is that we need to then ensure that governments are providing investment certainty, but also that governments are, being willing to support the rollout the development and rollout of new clean energy technologies. And I think that's absolutely where green hydrogen at a domestic level can and should play a role. And I think Tilly's point about what's happening in other jurisdictions, including Europe, is exactly right. We've got to make sure that we as Australians are actually leaders in this space, and not just sort of putting all of our eggs in one basket around one particular clean energy technology. The other final point here is that one of the great things I think about Australia is that really as a nation we've always been pretty good at not falling for the tall poppy syndrome. And by that I mean, I think at the moment natural gas currently is in the eye of public opinion, been sort of cast unfairly into the same box as coal, dirty coal. There is no doubt. I mean, there's not one person I speak to who agrees that we should not transition away from, natural gas to clean renewable gas. Of course we should. But I think we have to make sure, though, that when we're making decisions as a country about how we invest, develop, support renewable gas technologies, we're not falling into the trap of being too afraid to do so because we'll be worried about what the political pushback is. We have to do better than that, because if we don't, and to your question, we will find that there are Australians who are left behind, and I just don't think that sits consistently with our values as a country. A country who values fairness, who values equality, and frankly, who wants to make sure every Australian has got access to clean energy when they need it for as long as they need it.
So I'm going to change tack slightly now from what was in the budget to what this budget means for organisations and how they should approach the next budget cycle. And so I think there's a bit of a parable we can see for in the lead up to the budget. There was the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, also known as the POCOC Committee, which submitted a report, and the keystone recommendation was increasing JobSeeker to 90% of the aged pension. In turn, the government chose to ignore that recommendation in its entirety and instead raise payments by $40 a week. Is there anything that organisations can take from what is somewhat a failed attempt at a budget submission, and how you can align your goals with the goals of government?
And look, in fairness to Senator Pocock and the work of that group, I mean, them achieving a $40 increase, sure, it might be imperfect and it might fall outside of the expectations of the recommendation, but be under no illusion, it is a massive step forward. And I think it's only positive that the Prime Minister's come out today and said that, it's unfinished business and that there's, further increases potentially in future budgets. I'm amazed that he said that. I mean, I think that actually genuinely does speak to his background and his upbringing and his passion for these topics, because really a comment like that from the Prime Minister only adds impetus to the next campaign to increase these fixed income payments, as opposed to probably what the government might have been hoping, which was let's make an adjustment now so that then when we get onto the next and future budgets, we can say that we've addressed that public policy issue. Remembering, of course, that last night we saw a $4.2 billion surplus, but we also saw some of these deficits returning from next year. And just as an aside note there, I thought some of the predictions that Jim made were incredibly brave. I mean, to be able to stand up and talk about, inflation dropping from 6% back within a year, to be making wage forecasts. I mean, to be standing in front of the nation and making those predictions, I thought was pretty brave, particularly given we know some of the advisory agencies, not least the Reserve Bank of Australia, have had a tendency to get it pretty wrong lately. So, but anyway, in terms of the budget and to your point about the committee and the lift in the JobSeeker rate, the advice we always give to clients is that it's so important to have a plan. And the starting point for that is got to be, whether it's the federal, state or territory governments, all budgets are under strain because there are so many worthy causes, there are so many things that government funds appropriately. So to then be an organisation who wants to have a particular priority funded, you have to accept then that you are competing against all sorts of other organisations who also have ideas that are with merit, and you've got to make sure that your idea and your proposal is at the front of the pack and stays at the front of the pack. And ultimately, in the lead up to the budget, is the option that the government of the day chooses to support. So in terms of a plan, we work around the idea that you've got to be able to explain what your idea is about. You've got to make sure that's easily digestible for time-poor decision makers, their staff, bureaucrats. Also, you have to make sure there is some sort of costing that's attached to that. The ideas that actually help government save money are the ones that usually get ahead. And then, of course, to be thinking about, what's the communications that sit around that? Is there a media piece there to help lift the profile of a cause? Are there coalitions of support to be built? And then, of course, around that sits the government relations piece. So, not just always engaging with the minister or the treasurer first. And in fact, often we say that they're the last people you should actually go and talk to. But in the spirit of building coalitions of support, to be thinking about, if this idea is funded, who are the people who are going to benefit the most, and going to talk to their representatives first. And it is always better to have people who are of a government party, even if they're on the backbench, taking forward an idea to decision makers, including ministers, than having that come forward from elsewhere. So those types of strategies are the things that we usually work through with clients. And the most important thing of all is to think about the timelines, because budgets run like businesses to some extent. I know that's probably a bit of an unpopular thing to say, but they run like businesses to the extent that, preparing a budget's a big deal. And there are certain points in the political cycle and the timeline of the year that you need to make sure that your plan is executed against to make sure that your idea is given the best chance of success.
And so then my final question for you, Steve, is that the next federal election is probably going to occur in the mid-2025. So in many ways, the next budget is a quasi pre-election budget. And we know that sometimes it's a difference between a budget submission and then trying to get an election promise. With that in mind, how would you approach the next budget cycle in terms of for organisations who are trying to draft budget submissions now?
The next budget will be an election budget. You're absolutely right. Why? Because it comes in the year before the election year, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the government manages it. Why? Because again, we know last night there was a very modest surplus that was posted for the first time in 15 years, followed by a big deficit. Now, the thing in all of this is politically, Australians don't deal with the detail around the size of those surpluses and deficits. But what they are going to be told by the opposition is that Labor is back in deficit. And so that then risks, I think, for Labor being the tone, the narrative, the politics around its next budget. And I think also for people wanting to secure funding commitments from government in a climate where they are posting a deficit, the idea of having a plan and really executing against a plan is even more important to make sure that your idea gets ahead.
So that's all we have time for today. But if your organisation needs help with budget submissions, in our blog this month, we stepped out how to structure your submissions so they don't just gather dust on a ministerial desk. And you can find that article on our website or in the show notes below. And furthermore, if you don't forget to subscribe to MA Explains in your podcast player of choice or via our YouTube channel, and you have a topic that you'd like explored in the future, please let us know via a review or in the comments below. Thank you all for listening, and that was the Budget Explained.